Hello and welcome. You're watching Global Lens from the CNBC-TV18 Prime Ionic Wealth Studio with me, Parikshit Luthra. Over 190 nations have gathered in Brazil for the 30th UN Climate Conference, a crucial meeting that will shape the world's climate action over the next decade. Last year's summit produced a pledge to mobilize $300 billion a year by 2035, but developing nations, including India, said the commitment fell far short this year. Countries are under pressure to turn climate finance promises into a working framework and update their national climate plans. While Prime Minister Modi is not attending, India's delegation is being led by Environment Minister Bhupendra Yadav. The summit's opening, however, was chaotic. Heavy rain forced delays and later protests by activists demanding stronger indigenous representation led to scuffles with security for India. The stakes are significant. The country has rapidly expanded its solar and wind capacity and now generates half its installed power from non-fossil sources, 5 years ahead of its 2030 goal. Yet it still depends heavily on coal to meet rising energy demands, making it the world's second largest coal consumer after China. On day one, COP30 president said India and China will be critical to lowering global transition costs because both are scaling clean energy at unprecedented speed. This year's talks come as the US, historically the largest emitter, exits the Paris Agreement, again under President Trump, who has repeatedly questioned climate science. Meanwhile, 12 nations, including Brazil, Germany, France, Canada, Spain, signed the first global declaration on combating climate misinformation, committing to protect scientists, journalists, and researchers from online harassment and coordinated disinformation campaigns. Building on the uncertain legacy of COP29, host nation Brazil says this summit will focus on implementation, turning pledges into action and climate plans into measurable outcomes. Joining us right now to take this forward is Lord Adair Turner, Chair of the Energy Transitions Commission. Lord Turner, thank you so much for joining us. Will this COP deliver progress on climate action? The reason why I ask this, the political momentum is not there to achieve net zero.
Look, I think you are absolutely right to have described in your intro the very challenging circumstances that we now face. The fact is that the IEA, the International Energy Agency, put out on Wednesday a report that says it's really almost impossible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade without a significant overshoot and large amounts of removals. And that's concerning because that was the ideal objective set in the Paris Climate Agreement. It is still possible, however, to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, but that will require a significant acceleration of efforts across the world. And of course, as you pointed out, we face the challenge that America has just decided, the US has just decided it doesn't want to be part of this. Indeed, I think disgracefully, it is deliberately trying to discourage other groups of countries, such as those represented at the International Maritime Organization two weeks ago, to prevent other people from going ahead with policies that could reduce emissions. So we are in a very challenging time. I think this COP comes at a more challenging time for progress on climate change than we've faced for several years. On the other hand, what we are seeing is some technological developments, some collapse in the cost of solar panels and batteries and wind turbines and electric vehicles, which means that increasingly we have the tools available to accelerate the decarbonisation at a lower cost to consumers than seemed likely 5 or even 2 years ago. So we face a balance of concerning developments, really concerning developments for all countries in the world, because climate change will affect us all very, very badly, in India perhaps even more than some other countries. But we increasingly have the technological tools to solve it. What we have to do, and what I hope will come out later in this COP, are commitments to really sort of turbocharge the development of the good things that are happening, the new technology deployments, including there in India, the pace of renewables deployment. But I think India should be setting even higher targets beyond the 500 gigawatts that it has set.
Lord Turner, what do you expect India to do? We're working hard towards our energy transition goals, but what kind of leadership position can India take? Which are some of the areas in energy transition where we can work harder and faster?
Well, look, I would say three things about India. First, the rollout of renewables is occurring at a good pace, but it could be faster still. When we at the Energy Transition Commission have looked at, for instance, India's solar resource, it's absolutely phenomenal. And there are new technologies, things called agri-PV, which enable you to combine solar PV installations with continued agricultural production, which will loosen the land constraint on the rollout of solar PV. So I think, one, India should take its great developments that it's seen in renewables, and for instance, the innovations that it's had in what's called the round-the-clock renewables auctions, and it should turbocharge those even more. Secondly, it should continue to force an area where I think it's quite a leader at the moment. I think it is, in a way, ahead of Europe, for instance, in the developments of green hydrogen, and I think it should really drive that forward. And then third, and I think this is a bit where India is a bit behind, is on the electrification agenda. I mean, every time I go to Delhi, unfortunately now, the air quality is often terrible. The single biggest thing you can do in the short term to get better air quality is to electrify the two-wheeler and three-wheeler fleet. And increasingly, two-wheelers and three-wheelers are available electric, at a cheaper cost to consumers than the gasoline or diesel engines. So those three things: one, in the power sector, more renewables, more batteries, more storage; two, reinforce the leadership which India is already showing in hydrogen; and three, really grasp the electrification agenda, starting with the electrification of passenger traffic.
Right. I'd also like to ask you, how do we make climate finance more accessible to everyone? Every year at COP, we make commitments. Last COP was a commitment of $300 billion for climate finance, but it's not really being delivered at the pace necessary. What do you think emerging economies need to do? Because it seems that we will have to find our own resources for climate financing.
Well, look, I think the first thing to say is that emerging economies or developing countries come in many shapes and forms, and India is sort of in the middle. I mean, China, depending whether you call it a developing country any longer, that doesn't need finance from anybody in the world. It has the biggest savings rate, the biggest investment rate in the world. It can finance most of the investment, well, all of the investment domestically, and then finance a lot in the rest of the world. At the other end, places in low-income places in Africa, their domestic savings mobilization capability is very small. They will have to rely very significantly in inward flows of finance from the advanced economies, but also from China and from other middle and upper middle income countries. India is an interesting intermediate. India has, a high savings rate. India is capable of organizing investment. It has quite a high investment rate. A lot of the renewables development can be driven by either big companies like the Adanis or the Ambanis, a Reliance, or the multiple, very good medium-sized companies in that space, right? Renew Power. So India is not in the same position as Africa of being totally reliant on inward investment and financial flows from outside to drive its decarbonisation. The vast majority of India's investment will come from inside, and as a growing economy, it can increasingly do that. Having said that, right, I think the crucial thing on the global climate debates about climate finance is to stop putting it in these big buckets of 300 billion or 1,300 billion with lots of things together. There's a real difference between mobilizing huge sums of money through the development banks and through the private sector in order to support profitable investment. And that's in the hundreds of billions or even trillions of money required. But it's not grants, it's not gifts. This is about getting the global development banks to mobilize what they can do. At the other end of the spectrum, there are the need to provide simple, grants or concessional loans to really low-income, vulnerable countries. And I think we have confused the debate about climate change by adding together these very different things into these headline figures that, diplomats like to agree in the final communique of COPs, but really don't mean much.
You've spoken about the importance of decarbonization as the path to long-term energy security. What more can India do on that front?
Well, look, India ultimately has a great resource. It's sunshine, to a degree wind, but it has sunshine, huge levels of solar radiation, which could ultimately make it, self-sufficient in electricity and in an environment, not dependent on imported coal to drive its electricity. And of course, India, has a significant deficit in energy imports. It imports a lot of oil. And of course, that is very controversial at the moment, and it's produced a dispute with America because of the imports from Russia. But even without that geopolitical complication, it leaves India vulnerable to swings in the oil price. So the same strategy which India should deploy to get to a low and then zero carbon economy as its role in dealing with this global problem of climate change are also exactly the same actions which can enable India no longer to have the current account vulnerability, the external vulnerability that comes from being a big importer of energy. So I think energy security and greening the economy, decarbonising the economy are strongly aligned in India.
Right. My final question to you would be, what, according to you, would be the best outcome for COP30? If there were certain big takeaways you feel that this COP will deliver, that will be important for the world, what would those be?
I think the most important thing is an overall statement that the countries here are determined to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and that the fact that the US has pulled out of this process, which is deeply irresponsible for one of the richest countries in the world and one of the biggest emitters the second biggest now after China, to have done that is terrible. So the rest of the world has got to make a strong statement. We are still in. We know this is a joint problem. We're going to help solve it. I think also a reinforcement of the commitments which were made at Dubai in COP28, that we are all trying together to get to at least a tripling of renewables deployment by 2030, and committing the other commitment which was made at Dubai, a doubling of the pace of energy efficiency improvement. And the only way to do that is electrification. I think a series of statements that help concentrate people's minds on what it is, what are the big things that we need to do, which, if we do them fast enough, can still limit global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade.
All right, Lord Turner, thank you so much for being with us on the program, giving us your view on COP30 and what's the best outcome it could deliver. It's time for a short break here on Global.